My name is Walt Kessler, and for 31 years I have raised cattle on 240 acres that my grandfather cleared with a mule and a hand plow back when this valley didn't have a single paved road running through it. I want you to remember that number, 240 acres, because before this story is over, you're going to understand exactly why every inch of it mattered. This land came to me the way land comes to most ranching families, through sweat, through debt, through 3 generations of people who refused to sell no matter how good the offer looked on paper. My grandfather bought the original parcel in 1958. My father added 40 acres in the 70s when the Hendricks family went under during the drought. And I added the last piece myself in 1998, a strip along the eastern boundary that connected our grazing land to the creek access we needed to keep the herd watered through the dry months. I tell you all this because it matters to what happened next. This wasn't just dirt to me. It was 3 generations of decisions, 3 generations of surveys, 3 generations of a family betting everything on a piece of ground and winning. My grandfather used to say that a ranch isn't really owned, it's inherited on loan from the people who'll need it after you, and you spend your whole life paying that loan back by not losing an inch of it to carelessness. I grew up hearing that line at the dinner table so many times I could recite it in my sleep, and I never expected I'd end up living through the exact test he was warning me about. I run about 90 head of cattle most seasons, cow-calf pairs mostly, with a handful of yearlings I hold back to sell in the fall. It's not a huge operation, but every acre matters when you're rotating pasture and trying to keep grass from getting grazed down to nothing before the rain comes back. My wife Carol passed 6 years ago, so most days it's just me, my dog Ranger, and whatever hired help I can get during branding and shipping season. I mention this because when this whole mess started, I didn't have anybody in the next room to talk it through with every night. I had to sit with it myself, which is part of why I read those meeting minutes so carefully. And 2 years ago, a homeowners association decided that a chunk of that ground belonged to them. Let me back up and explain how a cattle ranch even ends up next to a homeowners association in the first place, because I know some of you are already confused. 15 years ago, a development company bought out the old Pemberton spread on my northern boundary and turned it into what they called Meadowbrook Estates, a gated community with 180 homes, a clubhouse, 2 ponds they called lakes, and a walking trail system that everybody bragged about at the county fair. When it went in, I didn't think much of it. My cattle didn't care about the neighbors. The fence line was the fence line. I kept to my side, they kept to theirs, and for over a decade that arrangement worked just fine. The trouble started when Meadowbrook's population outgrew its own infrastructure. The development had exactly 1 way in and 1 way out, a 2-lane road that connected to the state highway about 4 miles south. As the neighborhood filled up and a second phase of homes got built, that single road turned into a bottleneck. Emergency vehicles took too long getting in. School buses backed up traffic every morning. And at some point, somebody on the HOA board got the idea that the fix was simple: build a second access road. The problem was, there was only one direction that made sense for a second road, and that direction ran straight across the eastern third of my ranch. I found out about the plan the way most people find out about things that are going to upend their life, from a neighbor, almost by accident. Dale Whitfield, who leases some of my north pasture for his horses, mentioned at the feed store that he'd heard the HOA was finally getting that new road sorted out. I asked him what road he meant, and he looked at me like I'd ask him what color the sky was. The one through your east section, Walt, cuts out to Route 9. They've been talking about it at the HOA meetings for months. Months. They had been discussing running a road through my land for months, and nobody from that board had picked up a phone or knocked on my door. I want to be clear about something before I go further, because I know how these stories get told online, and I don't want you thinking I'm the kind of man who flies off the handle. I didn't storm anybody's office. I didn't put up angry signs. I drove into town. I requested the HOA meeting minutes through the county clerk since HOA records tied to development agreements are part of public filing in our state, and I sat down and read every page. What I found made my stomach turn. The HOA board had commissioned a traffic study 18 months earlier. That traffic study recommended a second access point. The board had then spent the better part of a year in closed session, which, by the way, is not supposed to happen for matters like this under our state's HOA transparency statutes, but that's a detail for later, discussing where that access point should go. And in the minutes from a meeting 4 months prior, the board president, a man named Roger Castellan, was quoted as saying, and I'm paraphrasing only slightly, the Kessler property is the only viable route. We'll need to pursue an easement or a partial acquisition. A partial acquisition of my family's land. discussed for months, decided without my knowledge, and only mentioned once at the tail end of a meeting where they figured, I suppose, that eventually somebody would have to tell me. Now here's where it gets worse, and where the real violation happened, not against me exactly, but against how this whole process is supposed to work. I later learned that Roger Castellan had also submitted an application to the County Planning Commission requesting what's called a road use permit. This permit doesn't grant ownership or easement rights. It's simply a preliminary step that lets a developer or an HOA propose a route for county review. But Castellan's application, filled out on behalf of the HOA, described the eastern section of my ranch as unused pasture land with no existing agricultural operation, which was false. That land had cattle grazing on it every single season, and I had records, grazing logs, veterinary visits, feed delivery receipts, going back over a decade to prove it. Worse, the application included what looked like a signed landowner acknowledgement form. My name was typed on that form. Not my signature. Nobody had forged my actual signature, thank God, or this would have gone criminal fast, but my name was typed into the landowner consent field with a note that said verbal agreement pending written confirmation. There was no verbal agreement. There had been no conversation of any kind between Roger Castellan and me about this road, ever, before I found out from Dale Whitfield at the feed store. I contacted the county planning office directly. I spoke with a woman named Patricia Nunez, who handled road use applications, and I explained the situation. She was sympathetic but explained that the county's preliminary approval process didn't require them to verify landowner consent at the application stage. That verification happened later, during the survey and easement phase, specifically because plenty of proposed routes never make it that far and the county doesn't want to burden landowners with formal notifications for projects that might die in committee. In other words, the HOA had gotten preliminary approval for a road across my land, using a description of my property that was inaccurate and a consent notation that was fabricated, and the system was built in a way that let all of that slide through because the real accountability wasn't supposed to happen until later. Well, I decided later was going to happen right then. I requested a meeting with the full HOA board, not just Castellan. I brought copies of my deed, my grazing records, and the Planning Commission application with the false statements highlighted. I brought my nephew Andy, who's a paralegal in the city and who agreed to sit in and take notes, because I've learned over the years that when you're dealing with a group of people who've already decided what they want to do, having a witness changes the tone of the room considerably. The meeting happened in the Meadowbrook Clubhouse, around a long table with a whiteboard that still had traffic diagrams drawn on it from a previous meeting I hadn't been invited to. Roger Castellan opened by thanking me for coming, which struck me as a strange thing to say to a man whose land you'd been quietly trying to acquire for the better part of a year. I laid the papers on the table. I asked him to explain the unused pasture description and the consent notation. To his credit, he didn't try to talk his way around it entirely. He claimed the application had been prepared by a consultant the HOA hired to handle the county paperwork, and that the consultant must have made assumptions about the property status and the landowner conversation based on an early phone call where, according to Castellan, someone from his office had left me a voicemail. I asked to hear that voicemail. He said it no longer existed. I told him plainly that regardless of what a consultant assumed, the application had gone to a government office with false information on it, that I had the grazing and veterinary records to disprove the unused claim in about 30 seconds, and that I intended to file a formal complaint with the Planning Commission unless the HOA withdrew the application entirely and started over with an actual conversation with the actual landowner, meaning me. One of the other board members, a woman named Ellen Marsh who I'd later come to respect quite a bit through this whole process, spoke up at that point and asked Castellan directly, in front of everyone, whether he had personally reviewed the application before it was submitted to the county. He admitted he had signed off on it without reading every line, trusting the consultant's work product. Ellen didn't say much after that, but I noticed she wrote something down and underlined it twice, and I got the sense right then that I wasn't the only person in that room who thought this had been handled badly. Andy slid the grazing logs across the table, cross-referenced with veterinary visit records showing routine herd health checks on the eastern section, month after month, for years. Nobody at that table could look at those records and still call the land unused with a straight face. Castellan didn't try. The board voted, right there in front of me, to suspend the application. I want to tell you that was the end of it, and for about 6 weeks, it felt like it was. But suspended isn't the same as withdrawn, and 6 weeks later, Andy called me with news that Roger Castellan had refiled, this time with my actual participation, because now they had no choice, but with a route that had shifted slightly and a new set of terms that I didn't like one bit. This is where the story turns into something I genuinely did not see coming. Under pressure from homeowners who wanted their second road, and facing an insurance and emergency access argument that the County Planning Commission found legitimate, because I'll admit, safety concerns about a single access neighborhood are real, and I'm not the kind of man who wants to stand between people and an ambulance getting to their kids faster, I agreed to sit down and negotiate an actual easement. Not a taking, not an acquisition, but a proper, compensated, legally documented easement that would let the HOA build a road across a defined strip of my eastern section, with terms that protected my grazing operations, my water access, and set real boundaries on what they could and couldn't do. We spent 2 months hammering out that agreement with lawyers on both sides, mine, hired with money I frankly didn't love spending, and theirs, paid for out of HOA dues that plenty of Meadowbrook residents were none too happy about once they learned how much all this legal back and forth was costing. Those 2 months weren't easy. 3 separate drafts came back with clauses I didn't like. One would have let the HOA expand the easement width later without renegotiating compensation, which my lawyer caught and struck before I ever had to raise a fuss myself. Another tried to limit my cattle crossing rights to a single window of time each day, which would have made rotational grazing nearly impossible during calving season. I sat through every revision line by line, because I'd already learned that assuming good faith wasn't a strategy, it was just an invitation for the next mistake. The final agreement gave the HOA a 60-foot wide easement running along a specific line I approved, in exchange for compensation, a guarantee that my cattle would retain unrestricted crossing rights at 2 designated points, and language that explicitly protected my creek access, since that strip of land ran close enough to the water that I wasn't about to let a road cut off what my herd needed to survive August. We also included a clause requiring any future modification to the road or the easement boundary to go through a joint review process with my written consent, something that hadn't existed in any of the earlier drafts and that Ellen Marsh, of all people, was the one who suggested adding. She told me privately after one of the meetings that she'd seen HOAs make promises to landowners before her previous address in another state, promises that quietly eroded a few years down the line once the original board members rotated out and nobody remembered the original terms. I was grateful for that advice, and it turned out to matter more than either of us expected. Everybody signed. County approved the survey request. And on a cold morning in March, a 3-man survey crew showed up at my gate with stakes, string line, GPS equipment, and a set of plans to mark the exact route the road was going to follow. I walked out with them that first morning, partly out of curiosity and partly, if I'm honest, because after everything that had happened, I wasn't about to let anybody put a single stake in my ground without me watching. The lead surveyor, a young guy named Marcus who I'll give credit to for being sharp-eyed and thorough, was working off the county's recorded parcel boundaries cross-referenced with the new easement description. About 2 hours in, Marcus stopped, looked at his equipment, looked at his tablet, and looked at me with an expression I'd come to recognize over the years as the face of a man who just found something he wasn't expecting. "Mr. Kessler," he said, "does your deed show your eastern boundary running along the old fence line, or does it run along the creek itself?" I told him what I'd always understood, the fence line, which my father built decades ago, roughly 40 feet west of the creek's edge, leaving a buffer strip that nobody had ever built on or claimed because it flooded some years and wasn't good for much besides letting the cattle drink. Marcus shook his head slowly. "According to the recorded plat and the GPS coordinates on your deed, your eastern boundary doesn't stop at the fence line. It runs along the creek's original channel, which shifted about 60 feet west sometime in the last 30 or 40 years, probably during flood events. Your legal boundary is still tied to the original creek description in the deed, not the current waterline. Which means, Mr. Kessler, you actually own about 11 more acres than your fence line has ever shown." I asked him to explain that in plain language, since at first I thought he'd misread the equipment. He walked me through it patiently. Creeks move, especially after major flood years, and our county had 2 of those in the 90s that old-timers still talk about. My grandfather's original deed described the eastern boundary as running along the creek itself rather than a fixed set of coordinates, what surveyors call a meander line, common in older deeds written before GPS made permanent coordinate boundaries easy to lock down. When a creek shifts significantly, the legal boundary described by that old language doesn't automatically follow the water unless the deed gets formally updated. Nobody had ever done that. The deed still described the boundary as it existed in 1958, and today's creek bed wasn't where the law actually said the line Saturday. My father had built the fence based on where the creek sat in his lifetime, a reasonable choice at the time, but he never realized the true legal boundary sat 60 feet further east, undisturbed and unclaimed the whole time. I stood there in my own pasture, land I had walked, worked, and fenced my entire life, and found out I owned more of it than I thought. But that wasn't the part that changed everything. Here's the part that did. Those extra 11 acres, the strip between my father's old fence line and the true legal boundary along the original creek channel, sat almost entirely inside the 60-foot easement corridor the HOA and I had just spent 2 months negotiating and legally documenting, which meant the compensation figure in our agreement, calculated by the HOA's appraiser based on the acreage they believed they were crossing, had been calculated using the wrong boundary entirely. They had priced out land based on the fence line. The real legal line put substantially more of my property, and more importantly a different portion of my property, inside that easement corridor. And it got more complicated still, because that 11-acre strip wasn't just extra pasture. Part of it fell inside a designated floodplain buffer under the county's environmental regulations, land that requires special permitting for any construction, road building included, because of runoff protections tied to the creek watershed. Nobody, not my old survey documents, not the HOA's consultant, not the original traffic study, had accounted for the fact that a chunk of the proposed road corridor sat inside a regulated floodplain buffer zone. I called Patricia Nunez at the planning office again. I explained what the survey crew had found. She pulled the watershed maps and confirmed it within the hour. A significant stretch of the approved easement corridor did indeed fall inside the buffer zone, and any construction there would require a supplemental environmental review and a separate permit process that could add months, possibly close to a year, to the timeline, along with construction requirements, retention systems, permeable surfacing, erosion controls. That would roughly double the projected cost of that stretch of road. When I brought this to Roger Castellan and the board, the room went quiet in a way I hadn't seen in any of our previous meetings. This wasn't a dispute about who was right or wrong anymore. This was a straightforward, verifiable fact that appended the entire financial and logistical plan they had sold to their own homeowners. Here's where I could have made things very difficult for them, and I'll admit, a part of me was tempted. I had leverage now. My actual legal boundary put more of my land, more valuable land, inside their planned route, and their own plan was now tangled up in a regulatory process they hadn't budgeted for or anticipated. I could have gone back to the negotiating table and asked for a lot more money, or refused to renegotiate at all and let the whole project collapse under its own weight. But I thought about Dale Whitfield's horses, and the school buses backing up every morning, and the fact that somewhere in that neighborhood there were families who genuinely needed a second way out in case of fire or flood or a medical emergency at 2 a.m. This had started as a fight because people tried to take something from me without asking. It didn't have to end as a fight just because I finally had the upper hand. So I proposed something different. Instead of running the road along the original corridor, straight through the newly discovered floodplain buffer, I offered an alternate route that shifted the road roughly 90 feet north, staying entirely on the fence line side of my property, avoiding the buffer zone completely, and requiring no supplemental environmental permitting at all. It added a modest curve to the road design and meant the HOA's engineers had to redraw their plans, but it would actually save them money in the long run by avoiding the floodplain construction requirements altogether, and it could move forward on the original timeline instead of getting delayed by a year of regulatory review. I also renegotiated the compensation, not upward out of spite, but to reflect an honest, updated appraisal of the actual acreage and the specific parcel being used, done by a neutral third-party appraiser. Both sides agreed on this time, instead of a number that had been calculated on an outdated fence line assumption. Roger Castellan, to his credit, and I want to be fair to the man because people can surprise you, went back to the full HOA membership and explained everything, the original mistake, the floodplain discovery, and the revised route I'd proposed. At the community meeting where this was presented, I was invited to speak, which surprised me given how the whole thing started with nobody bothering to speak to me at all. I stood up in that clubhouse, the same room where Castellan had once tried to explain away a fabricated consent form, and I told the residents of Meadowbrook Estates the truth. I told them I understood why they wanted a second road. I told them my family had ranched that land for 3 generations and I wasn't going to let anybody take a piece of it without a real conversation and a real agreement, but that once we had that real agreement, I wanted the road built right, safely, and in a way that didn't leave either side holding a bad deal because somebody rushed the paperwork at the start. The revised plan passed with the board's approval and, more importantly, with a level of community trust that the original plan never had, because now everybody understood exactly what land was involved, exactly what the environmental considerations were, and exactly what had gone wrong the first time around. Construction started that summer. Marcus and his crew came back out to re-stake the corrected route, and this time I walked every single stake with them personally, checking each marker against the new agreement before it went into the ground. About a week into the restaking, I caught a discrepancy of my own. A stake set 8 feet inside the boundary we'd actually agreed to, probably an honest transcription error. I flagged it immediately, Marcus checked his numbers, agreed I was right, and had it corrected before any equipment broke ground there. Small thing, but it told me the habit of checking everything myself wasn't just useful during the fight, it was going to matter for the rest of my life on this land. The road took about 4 months to build, graded, and compacted with culverts laid where the ground dipped toward the creek, and a base poured for a paved 2-lane surface wide enough for a fire truck and school bus to pass each other. They graded it properly so it doesn't wash out in a hard rain, and built a proper cattle crossing into the design at the 2 agreed points, complete with a cattle guard and supplemental gate, so my herd can still move freely between pastures without ever touching pavement. I'll admit there were days that summer when watching heavy equipment roll across ground my grandfather cleared by hand stirred something complicated in me. It wasn't anger anymore, the anger had burned off during the fight itself, but something closer to reflection. I thought about him a lot that summer, wondering what he'd have made of it all, a road, a mistake, a discovery, and in the end a fairer outcome than anybody expected going in. I like to think he'd have approved, even if he'd have grumbled the whole way through it, same as I did. Dale Whitfield's horses use the same road now to get to the vet clinic on the north side of the county without adding 20 minutes to the drive. Emergency response times into Meadowbrook dropped by almost half, according to the fire district's own report, since the new access means a truck doesn't have to fight the same bottleneck as every family trying to leave for work at the same time. And me, I ended up with a properly surveyed, properly documented deed that reflects a legal boundary I'd walked past my entire life without ever knowing it was really mine. 11 acres I didn't know I had, protected now on paper the way it always was in fact, plus a fair compensation for the easement, plus a road my own cattle use every single day. I think about how differently this could have gone if I hadn't asked to see those meeting minutes, if I'd let a typed name on a consent form stand in for an actual conversation, if I'd let an outdated fence line define a boundary the law never actually recognized. Land only stays yours if you know exactly where it starts and where it stops, on paper, not just where your father happened to string a fence 40 years before satellite surveying made all of this possible to check. Roger Castellan and I aren't exactly friends, but we nod at each other now at the feed store, and last month he asked me if I'd be willing to sit on a newly created HOA Transparency Committee, the kind of thing that gets formed after a community learns the hard way why closed-door decisions about somebody else's land are a bad idea no matter how good the intentions behind them are. I told him I'd think about it. What I know for certain is this. They came in expecting to take a road across land they thought they understood. What they got instead was a lesson in reading the actual paperwork, respecting the people who hold it, and understanding that sometimes the ground beneath a plan can shift on you in ways that have nothing to do with rivers and everything to do with doing the work right the first time. If there's one thing I'd want anybody watching this to take away from what happened on my ranch, it's simple. Whatever land you hold, whatever agreement somebody puts in front of you, read it yourself, walk it yourself, and never assume the line on somebody else's map is the same as the line the law actually recognizes. Mine wasn't. And that difference changed everything. Thanks for listening to my story. If you've ever had a fight over land, a fence line, or a neighbor who thought they could just take what wasn't theirs, I'd like to hear about it. And if you want to see how the rest of that road turned out, and how the cattle crossing held up through its first spring flood, let me know in the comments, because that's a story too.